Welcome everybody. What you're seeing here in the cover slide is a cartoon that is part of the blogs that Audrey mentioned. And the intent of the cartoons are really to summarize and teach a lot about kindness. And there's this nerdy looking guy we call Prof. K, who, when I had a goatee, was a caricature of me. But really, it's about showing a lot of the different aspects. And I'm going to share that with you. And I know, Lionel and I particularly engaged in this discussion years ago, is that we will come around to happiness because there's obviously a lot of relevance. Up in the corner, you'll see there's a quote from Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Nobel laureate in literature, is kindness, I've discovered, is everything in life. And here, the center part of kindness, we're going to touch on connection and happiness and better health and longevity, as well as romance, a little bit in animals, a little bit about contagious. But what I'm really going to try to show you is to dispel some myths. However, perhaps you've got other things you want to do. Perhaps I start to bore you. Here are the top lines that you can take home. The first is that I want to try to dispel the myth that it's just a dog-eat-dog world where we're in the survival of the fittest and we're in competition, and that kindness is actually an add-on. That's not going to be the case, and I hope to make that argument for you and to you, and that nature, in fact, wanted us to be kind to one another. The biology is actually built for that, and that in kindness is part of connecting to each other in a positive or caring way. And in fact, it's key to survival. I'm going to show you a quote from Darwin. He had recognized this, and by the way, he never wrote Survival of the Fittest. And then I'm going to go on to talk about how we're wired and the evidence for that we're wired to respond to kindness, and that how it feels good is really an activation of the brain's reward system. In other words, so there's neurophysiology that is behind this, that's built to say, this feels good, do more. Kindness and happiness reinforce each other in a cycle. And then going to the biology is like, okay, well, that's all nice, but does it have any other meaning beyond it? And even in and of itself, it would have a lot of meaning. But here, kindness has import to survival, how long people live, to how people select mates for long-term relationships and reproduction. And a central part of this is stress reduction. Because as stress, and we're going to go through I'm going to teach you a little bit about stress and the biology of it, hopefully without stressing you out, but it's very related to healing. So seeing kindness can uplift people, promote happiness, reduce stress, and promote connection. Now, there are allied concepts in kindness that I want you to keep as bundled when I'm talking about kindness, because they come from somewhat different literatures. The other thing that I'd like you to keep in mind is most of the images that you're going to see, the positive ones or the ones from kindness, are from our own portfolio. They come from around the world, from over 120 countries. So the allied concepts here are altruism, which is giving without any expectation of return, compassion, feeling for the suffering of others, empathy, feeling what someone else is going through, gratitude, forgiveness, and volunteerism. And then there would be others, but those would be the major ones. So, as I've said to you before, kindness is the default state of most living beings. If you take that as a truism, it's really important. And then there's a quote here that we rise by lifting others, which is from a 19th century orator, lawyer, who also was interestingly nicknamed the Great Agnostic. But he wrote, in fact, I came across a quote he had about happiness, which is essentially that happiness is about being happy now, finding out how we can be happy, but also the last piece is happiness is what we do for others. So to start with, we're wired to be kind. So if you take a step back and you look at the system of how our relationships have evolved, and this is true for many animal species, the intent of nature is to maximize survival, which means, and in Darwinian terms, being able to reproduce and live longer, right? That's what all of this is about, reproductive fitness. So in this case, if thinking, I want you to think in evolutionary terms. You're now all becoming evolutionary biologists and psychologists. Kindness then is, of course, the first glance is it's required for nurturing the young. And you think about it, right? A baby is born and the mother, who still needs to survive and gather food, right, has built-in mechanisms and hormonal systems that say, no, you pay attention to this baby, you nourish the baby, and you sacrifice for the child because that is how we perpetuate the species. Otherwise, in a dog-eat-dog world, in a purely survivalist world, the mother, of course, would take care of herself and abandon the young. It's the simplest and most obvious, I think, of these explanations. But then the same, of course, can extend to kin. But if you go further and you say, well, okay, do children, before they can even have moral development, do they show evidence of kindness? And there are multiple toddler studies in which the toddler will naturally help an investigator. The investigator drops a pen on the floor. The toddler naturally goes and picks up that pen and basically hands it back, and then he or she goes on their way. The same thing is said to be true, that there's evidence for that in infants. So in other words, this interest in helping is already baked in. And it's not, of course, just humans. You see it in non-human primates. You can also see it in ants, bats, rats, dolphins, elephants. Many, many species do this. Other species, for example, they may call out when a predator is near. And that calling out is a manifestation of warning the others that they're willing to sacrifice themselves and warn the others that the predator is coming. So how does nature do this? And they drive us to want to connect and really care for one another. So as I mentioned in the summary, we're built in, the wiring is built into our nervous systems, in our brain, but also in the heart, in the gut. There's actually several different subsystems that get involved. But I'm sure all of you have had the experience, particularly in a group like this, when you feel good, you have a pleasure sensation by being connected to somebody else in a positive way. Whether that's as simple as a smile, a handshake, holding the door for somebody, saying hello, etc. And if you reflect on your own positive relationships with family and friends, that may help you say, yeah, I did feel that way. And then if you take it a little bit further and ask, after I've helped somebody, after I've done something for someone else, how did I feel? This is called the helper's high. I didn't create that term. It was created by a guy named Alan Lux, a few decades ago, actually. But it captures that feeling. And you may know it as a feeling of warmth, right? A relaxation, a fullness in the chest, That's a benign fullness, you know, it's not a scary thing. All of that is part of that reward response. The reciprocal of this, of course, is loneliness, is disconnection. And loneliness, of course, which is, you know, described by many as epidemic. Vivek Murthy, one of the Surgeon Generals during Obama's presidency, has been campaigning for this. In the UK, they created a minister of loneliness. These are pretty big problems. One can look at it and say, loneliness is just the opposite, right, of being positively connected, and it becomes a painful event. And the resolution of the pain, why nature built that in, is said, you need to go and connect. Connect with someone else and you can resolve or solve this pain and feel better. It's also the same reason why losing a loved one is so painful. Why social isolation, whether that's for the elderly or if you think about it in people in prison, is also so painful. We need to connect in a positive way that also in which we care about each other. I'm sorry, was someone saying something? Okay, because I'll do questions if we can hold them to the end. So there's a lot of neurology behind this, and I've talked about some of it. But let's just take apart some to show you how this system is really put together. For example, we have a system in our brain that allows us to recognize and interpret facial expressions, body language, and touch. Think about it. You see someone hugging another person. You see another person smile or frown, right? Or an open hand versus a clenched fist. They all have meaning, and this meaning transcends culture. So if we went to Papua New Guinea or a remote region of the Amazon, and we wanted to see, to test this, which has already been done, people understand and recognize this as well. It's pretty universal. The system is also built with structures in the brain that are responsible for empathy, meaning, wow, I see what you're going through and I can feel it myself. Now there's, just for clarification, there are two types. Psychologists have broken empathy into cognitive, where it's something that's knowledge or fact-based, and emotional. And most of what I'm really speaking about is emotional, but they tie together. Altruism that we just talked about, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for another without any precondition of necessarily having reciprocation. In other words, it isn't a quid pro quo or tit for tat. It is I'm giving to you because I know that you and I are connected, and your survival, your faring well, is tied to mine. And then finally, there are also systems of emotional contagion. So if you've ever walked into a room and people are smiling and laughing, and it picked up your own mood, or you walked into a room and they're kind of downtrodden and sullen. Emotions are highly contagious. And this has been shown time and again, and it affects how we interact with other people. Okay, so now there are, these points are reinforced when there are lesions or injuries in specific areas, and they can manifest as deficits. And these are how we learn more about them. And then hormonal systems, which you may have heard, I don't know how much you all have heard about oxytocin. It's been nicknamed the love hormone, which, you know, it's a lovely name. But nevertheless, it was, you know, really described as regarding maternal infant attachment. It's involved in uterine contraction, but yet more literature shows how it antagonizes the response to stressors, and this is important, and it promotes social behavior. And then there are parts of the reward system, which you've heard about, no doubt, called endorphins and endocannabinoids, that come in to reinforce that good feeling. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of the dog-eat-dog world, because I love to clarify this when I learned it myself. So Darwin had two major books, right? The first one was The Origin of the Species. The second one was The Descent of Man. And Darwin struggled with this problem because he saw that all of these different species members were sacrificing for one another, but he was trying to resolve what he called natural selection, and the evolution of traits for the pressure to survival with the willingness of an individual to sacrifice. And what he wrote in The Descent of Man, after he struggled with it, is he said that communities which included the most sympathetic or altruistic members would flourish best. In other words, those groups, not just an individual, would, if people were sacrificing, would do the best. As a footnote, he never said survival of the fittest. That was a guy named Herbert Spencer, who was another British scientist in the 19th century, but Spencer was very Hobbesian, was very negative about the world, etc., and hypercritical. Now, you know, while some may not exactly call economics in this sense science, what I was talking about is physiology, of course, Adam Smith's the father of capitalism, and he wrote now he's in the 18th century, The Wealth of Nations. But his first book was on the moral of sentiments. He talked about and came back to and revised the book after he wrote How Capitalism Works, that we have to take care of each other. That he described this inner voice that knows that we're all connected to act in accord with it. So beyond just even this notion of nature, right, that capitalists might look to Smith and say, well, you know, Smith didn't believe it. Well, he didn't write it in The Wealth of Nations, but it's in his other book, like Darwin didn't write it in The Origin of Species. It's in The Descent of Man. Okay, so how else does this manifest? And there are some fun things. You know, the old aphorism, nice guys finish last. Well, it actually isn't true. So if I took a picture of, let's say, you know, any guy, and let's say I'm on a dating app, and I, you know, put in the picture, and he likes sports, he, you know, likes to go to the movies, and a third thing is he volunteers to, you know, help the homeless. And I take that same picture, and he likes sports, and he likes to go to the movies, and he likes to play video games. And you ask, in this case, they were all heterosexual studies, but you ask women to rate how handsome or how attractive he is. He gets bonus points in the first one. Same picture, everything else is the same, so that the notion of being kind is built into us as a point of attraction. And the reason is because that evolutionary biologists would say is because he would then stick around for the long haul. When times got tough, he would provide for the kin. And so that is the teleology or explanation they provide. Similarly, it affects kindness, or the perception of kindness or generosity increases interest in the partner in another study for a long-term relationship. Not for a one-night stand, it turns out, but for longer-term dating. So in addition to being perceived as kind changes its attraction, it also is reflected in male behavior. So when heterosexual men who are being watched by women are in a study, and they have to make a decision about a donation. So in one part of the study, they're watched by women. In another part, they're watched by no one. And then the third part, and again, they're all heterosexual men, are watched by other guys. Their willingness to donate more is when they're being watched by women. So there's another piece of connection that goes on here. And so ultimately is what I was talking about. You select a mate that will provide. So let's start to talk a little bit more about health. And we're going to come back to health in more detail when we talk about stress. It's really hard to measure kindness. When I started out with Envision, it was about 6-7 years ago, and I started to want to look at the biology of all of this. There wasn't an easy way to assess, how do you measure this stuff? So I ended up finding the literature on volunteerism, which I had never seen before, while in medicine. And it turned out, totally blew my mind, that people who volunteer regularly have death rates that are 20 to 40% lower than those who don't. Now, this may not sound like a lot to you because you're not used to looking at the numbers, but to give you perspective, if you took a place that had contaminated water and you were able to convert it to clean water, the decrease in death rate would be about 20%. If you went from major vaccination against major diseases like measles, the decrease in death rate is about 20%. So what we're talking about is huge. Now it's complicated, and these are complicated studies, and I'm not minimizing that, and I won't drag you into the mire of how complicated they are. But it's a really powerful observation, and multiple studies have shown it. It's not just like one study, it's multiple. And scientists do meta-analyses to teach this and affirm it. So the likely mechanism here is stress reduction through connection. Because what does volunteering do? And I bet a lot of you volunteer. And I bet if you reflect on how you feel after you were volunteering, you probably will tie to that, and it'll tie back to that warm feeling or the relaxed feeling. I experience it. I volunteer at a meal center, and I got to tell you, it's that I love what I do during the day, but it's probably the happiest that I am whenever I get to do it. And so we're going to talk a bit about stress, but what I want you to keep in mind is this is about social support and connection. And although this is one line, there are many, many studies about how social support buffers stress or decreases the response to it. So let's talk a little bit about stress. And this is intended to be educational and not to induce it. All right. And hopefully I can motivate you to, even further think about how you can improve it for yourselves. So before COVID-19, people were already experiencing a lot of stress. Americans have bragging rights of being tied for 4th amongst the most stressed countries in the world. And by the way, the other 3 are Sri Lanka, Iran, and I think it's Armenia. So we are a nation that lives with a good deal of stress. And COVID, of course, has made this, much worse. It's due to a myriad of reasons: personal health and family health, or family issues, financial issues, workplace stress, which we'll talk a little bit more about. It causes or worsens disease, and I'll talk about these in more detail. Workplace stress in particular is epidemic. And although the WHO is not exactly, has had its own bumps in the road recently, it has labeled years ago that workplace stress as being epidemic. There's a recent study that there are 120,000 excess deaths from workplace stress and each year. So all of this, of course, is amplified by COVID. But what this manifests as is burnout, right? So we get where we have anxiety, we have stress, we have depression, and we burned out and we get desensitized to it. This slide is to give you a sense of the proportion of workers who are experiencing stress. The orange bar is, or peach color, however your monitor is resolving it, is the US, and the blue is the UK. And what you can see is that from moderate stress to high stress, or even high to unsustainably high, we're talking about just about a third or so of the respective populations. And this, as I mentioned, results in a lot of deaths and also costs a lot of money, in part due to healthcare, in part due to absenteeism and something called presenteeism. Is a word I hadn't encountered until I started reading this literature. But essentially is you're physically there, but you've checked out. So somebody's at work and they're on their Facebook page or doodling or elsewhere. In the EU, this has been estimated at $600 billion. And an interesting stat was that burned out employees are about 23% more likely to visit an emergency room than non. So it's really a microcosmic observation of the effect of this stress. So how does this all come about? And I'm not going to dive into every detail here, but this is to give you a sense of how this the disease process happens. So the stressor, right, is the event or that is inducing or could induce a stress response. So for a lot of people, for example, healthcare bills are a major stressor because it's also the major cause of bankruptcy in the US, right, of personal bankruptcy. Or workplace stress or discrimination is a huge stressor. Loneliness we talked about, bullying, which I'm not going to get into too much, or a lack of purpose and meaning. These stressors induce the body to make a stress response. And I'm sure you've heard about something called fight or flight, which is when something's immediate and you got to respond and it's like, oh, wait, there's a tiger after me, I got to run. Or a car is approaching me, I better cross the street, and your pace quickens and your muscles tighten up and you go. So those are short term, but now these stressors often are chronic or longer term. And so what happens is that there's an activation of the autonomic nervous system. There are two parts to it. One is called the sympathetic part, and the other one, the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is turned on. Adrenaline comes from the sympathetic. The released epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline, released from the adrenal glands. Cortisol, the hypothalamus and pituitary, it's all tied together to facilitate this. But when chronically, this results in elevated blood pressure. This results in inflammation and immune dysregulation. What inflammation is that we have cells and molecules in our body to help tissues repair themselves, to fight off infection. These get chronically activated and dysregulated. What I mean by dysregulated is people who are stressed are much more prone to infection. You probably know that, like you're stressed out, you get a cold or the flu gets worse. Well, it turns out that major infections are much worse in people who had pre-existing stress. People who were infected with HIV had a more rapid progression to AIDS who are stressed. So you add these things together, they go on for a long time. And then, of course, there's issues about the person in terms of how much they know about health, their own nutrition, their genetics and their family background. You put all this together and you get varying diseases. Here under mental health, it's problems with decision-making, anxiety, depression. People have more rapid onset for cognitive decline. That's the road to dementia. They have sleep disorders, and all of this, of course, winds together and make it complicated. Heart disease is a major problem, diabetes, asthma, infection we talked about, and wound healing. And then complicating all of this is drug use. And you may have heard about this from deaths of despair. Yes, I know that, Audrey, this is the Happiness Club. But I'm trying so we're going to give background so we can elevate from it. But people, of course, compensate with diet and smoking and lack of exercise, and then there's selfishness and anger. And then what happens is all this feeds back here, right? Because now people are ill. Now they got more problems. And so they have additional stressors, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And this affects quality of life and survival. So I've listed these disorders. In fact, I can probably skip this slide, but what I also really want you to think about, and it's not proven, but it raises the possibility of increased susceptibility to COVID or a worsening course. So the things that we can do to manage stress and be happier, truly happier, and what psychologists would call eudaimonic happiness are critical. Now, one major reason for stress is a struggle to find purpose and meaning. So I don't know if for those of you who haven't seen this, this is something called Maslow's pyramid. Abraham Maslow was a 20th century psychologist who described these levels in the pyramid of basic needs, and he looks at it as a progression upwards. So physiologic, breathing, food, water, sex, sleeping, etc. Safety, security, employment, morality, health for the family, property, and then it starts to get into relationships, right? Where now you have love and belonging, so connection is in here. And then you have esteem and confidence, and then self-actualization, or what he would call, what Viktor Frankl might have really called, true meaning, knowing that we have purpose. So to feel valued and respected is a huge part of this. And some people, unfortunately, many, mistake the hedonic happiness, like, oh, I have a lot of money, I have a big title or a job, or I drive a great car. And I'm not slighting any of that. Those are all nice things, but they don't last long. True happiness, right, what I'm sure you've heard from your other speakers, is being connected to others, is doing for others, caring. That's what many have said. There was an article, I think it was in the New York Times, but sorry, I read so much, of a very wealthy hedge fund manager who was making probably $1 million to $2 million a year. And he was complaining that he felt dead inside. What was he doing with his life? So he was obviously very wealthy and had a lot of resource, but it was all external, it wasn't internal. So meaning is a big deal and a cause of stress. Okay, so here's Prof. K again. And this one is I put this up to really give you to take advantage of seeing this cycle. So if we start with kindness, we can generate this helper's high. So happiness is also inside of here. The recipient is valued. So when I am kind to you, right, I'm making a statement that we're connected to each other. You have value. Because otherwise, if you didn't, why would I even recognize you? Why would I be kind to you? On the flip side, remember, it's why bullying and ostracism are so painful. That's why it's painful, because it's a disconnecting event. So the things that connect us to each other are rewarding, and we feel we get good health from it, we are happier, and it's a source of meaning. Because when we're connected to each other, we know that we have purpose. We belong, right? People have a natural need. We're social animals to belong. A natural outcome of this also, which I'm not going to have time to talk about at length, is pay it forward. Because I want to mimic that behavior and I want to feel this again. Because nature has given me that tool, that ability. The disconnectors, of course, are ego, greed, fear, anger, loneliness, and violence. Okay, so you've heard my diatribe on this. Kindness is a natural antidote to stress. And there are others, and we can talk about them, like meditation and exercise. But you go to Midas, you get a muffler. Here, I run Envision Kindness. This is what you're getting. However, I'm also happy to talk about the others because I know a bit about them. So, but it's really a path to meaning and purpose. I'm going to focus on the workplace a little bit because that's really where people gather the most. But this is, as what I wrote as a subtitle, it's valid almost everywhere. So the workplace, for kindness, is if we're wanting to connect people, it's to both decrease the negative behaviors, but also increase the positive behaviors. So like teamwork. And when I care for internal or external customer, an internal customer is obviously a teammate, a colleague. An external customer is obviously somebody we sell to or we might buy from. We're all customers of each other. I used to work at Pfizer years ago and I learned, well, everybody's a customer. So all of this decreases stress and fosters meaning in terms of kindness. And it's also a way, when people are happier, of course, to decrease turnover and improve productivity. So you might say, well, that's all well and good, but A, I'm still a cynic, and I think people are, can be mean. And B, even if you're right, how do you promote it? That's really tough because nobody, I don't believe a single person really wants to be told you could be kinder. Because no one wants to think of themselves that way. And everyone can be kind. It may just be a little, but it, could be a lot. But the issue is really, could we always be kinder? And we think about it as a continuum. So without, though, trying to go at moral persuasion, is there a way to inspire people without moralizing, without lecturing them, by letting them feel it and tapping into the biology that they already have, that each of us on this call have? And I'm sure the people on this call in particular are exceptionally well developed in this. So it turns out, and the secret sauce of what we do is that simply seeing it has these positive and beneficial effects. There's a term psychologists called elevation, which is essentially this reward response manifesting. And that you can, if you see somebody else doing something nice, you feel good. So all of this stuff is still built in, and okay, it generates a reward response in the brain, and it also has been shown in multiple studies to change behavior. So it builds trust. It also can explain how kindness spreads, and we talked a little bit about mimicry, because things that feel good, you also want to repeat. This, by the way, is an image from the park ranger in Kenya. So we studied this when we first were starting out a few years ago. Really, I'm a nerd. And really, though, at my son's behest, who helped me start Envision, said, let's do a clinical study. And I do a lot of clinical studies, although not like this. So we got a group of psychologists who knew what they were doing to help us. And we ended up studying 400 people over the internet. And we showed them different kinds of images. These negative images, this is a graph of joy and happiness. And then they were randomized into one of four groups. So 100 people saw negative images, dark, disgusting things. 100 people saw neutral images, those that are hammers, doorknobs, towels, that kind of stuff. 100 people saw positive images, typical go-tos that people go look at: puppies in a basket, bunnies, flowers, a mother and child, which I would have called a kindness image. And then there were 100 people that saw what we call kindness images, and some weren't so pretty. A woman in distress on a dark stairwell being comforted by a police officer, a sea of shaven heads with one face looking up, and it's a young man going for chemotherapy. And there was a little text. And we did all of these scales, and for interest of time, I'm showing you joy. So the negatives, people fell like a rock. They were upset, they were unhappy, etc. For the neutral images, they actually got a little sad. They got probably bored. The positives raised their own report of happiness. But the kindness images had about double the effect. And this was also true for gratitude, hope and optimism, love and trust. For feeling compassionate, the positive images changed nothing. The kindness images had a soaring 75%. So imagine the bar goes up here, increase. And all of them were inspired, and they all were elevated by that psychology term, as I mentioned. The kindness images also decreased irritation and anger where the positive images didn't. And these people were actually they were pretty happy when they entered the study, so their irritation and anger was actually pretty low. So really then the challenge becomes, when I saw this, I was blown away, because it actually is what set me to go and study the biology of kindness, because I realized this was no accident. You can't get results like that in that kind of number of people by any accident. It's really unlikely. So it raised the question, how do we do this regularly? Because life comes at people regularly. And the nice thing is this stuff works really fast. Probably works within a few seconds. The shortest time has been that studies, not ours, that have been published using commercial films are 2 to 3 minutes. So how do we do this? So what we really now doubled down on is uplifting people through images of kindness. Yeah, we're also based in Connecticut. And we promote kindness, compassion, love, and joy, as Audrey read, through images. And the intent is to reduce stress and strengthen interpersonal connection. This is really where I think all of the effects are. And that people, as what I've just talked about, they just are much more in a positive space. So what we then did is said, well, okay, the images are great, but what we really need is to make this in motion. So we took the images and incorporated them into video. And the intent, because the eye and the brain is always looking for motion all the time. If you think about looking at a still image, your brain will turn it off pretty quickly, which is why people are constantly looking for things. So, and if you've seen a Ken Burns documentary where he keeps still images, he keeps them in motion while there's a narration, he does that very deliberately because of that brain mechanism, because he doesn't want you to, he wants you to keep engaged in what you're seeing. So we're streaming these into, or starting to stream them into more stressful environments. And really right now focusing in healthcare settings, but there are other stressful environments, and I've gotten interest expressed in them, and we're just trying to manage what we can. So these are corporate environments, schools. Schools are really struggling now, etc. And what we know, and I'm going to show you a bit more about, is that this in the video format works really well. So our objectives in healthcare are to positively shift the medical care, emotional, and spiritual environment. We really want to enhance the experience for everybody. to lower that stress, to deepen the connection with the staff there, and that people are more positive, because it's that positivity and that hope that will also instill calm, and people will listen better to one another, be kinder to each other, and then that will improve the provider-patient engagement. It will lift both, and so people will be more satisfied. And docs and nurses, you should know, as well as dentists and dental staff, have burnout rates and depression and suicide that are at least double that of the general public. So I'm going to show you a study we just recently completed in a dentist's office, and talk a little bit about it. I'm not showing videos tonight, but you can see them. You can see a demo reel on our site. But the intent was make it a real world study. So in a real world, like, okay, here's an office and there are things going on, and this was a pediatric dental practice, because it was a good friend who was really supportive and interested in what we were doing, and made it very feasible to do our first study. But the parents are registering kids, they're corralling their kids, they're taking care of paperwork, etc. And they're being called in, and people are going in and out. So you can imagine it's a moderately busy setting. There were 50 participants, the parents and staff, and Inspire, frankly, the people filled out a questionnaire, saw 8 minutes of this video, which had a variety of content, and then completed the questionnaire. The graph on the right shows you how inspired they were. This is just them rating themselves on a scale from 1 to 5. And children's programming, so not CNN, they were rated at 1.9, or about 2, let's say. If it was CNN, we probably would have had to have a negative scale there. Here, seeing the content, both parents and staff were markedly uplifted. They had a very different sense of how they were feeling. And this was also true for how happy they were, how calm they were, how grateful they were, and as well as optimistic. We did a generosity test because we wanted to see, does it not just emotion change, but does behavior change? And in this case, they were all told that they would have a $5 gift card once they completed the study, cash on the line. But they were asked at the end whether they saw either the children's programming or Inspire. Well, you could keep the gift card, or you can donate it to a family in need that attends the clinic. And with a ratio of about 2 to 1, the people who saw Inspire donated compared to the children's programming. And then finally, the vast majority of people wanted the practice to continue to show it. So it's easy to deploy. I won't go through all of this. There's complementary content with suggestions and animation, as well as humorous pieces, all to round it out, but all centered on kindness and connection. I'll skip over this because, in interest of time. And so there are other benefits that come, but the real one is quick and passive. So in other words, I'm not trying to convince you to be kind. We're just showing it. It's the viewer who takes it from there. That means not asking people to spend time training, like meditation. And by the way, I meditate regularly, and I love it, but it requires practice and training. Here, we're not even asking. Moreover, this helps with, I believe, once used widespread, will help with the social fabric that unfortunately has been torn to shreds in recent time. Now, the other part of this, and why I think that this is important, is that it ripples outwards. And I'm guessing that many of you have seen the movie Pay It Forward, or you've heard the expression kindness is contagious. So really what this is people see kindness, and the content is a drop in the water that starts the ripple, but people carry that ripple forward. So then other people are seeing these people act in accord, and maybe it's just not even saying something critical, but they get to witness it and then propagate it themselves. It just needs to be done regularly. So it has a lot of implications for public health. I became a believer in that. And for collaboration and quality of life, which is really why we started this, so people can have a higher quality of life. And I just come back to asking you to reflect on for yourself how you feel after seeing the images. I could show you data all day. That doesn't matter as much as how you feel, because that informs it. So to close with a couple of quotes, this is FDR. I guess it's very pertinent to today's political scene, but human kindness has never weakened the stamina or softened the fiber of a free people. A nation does not have to be cruel to be tough. And then Einstein, compassionate people are geniuses in the art of living, more necessary to the dignity, security, and joy of humanity than the discoverers of knowledge.